Good morning, everyone. Today is a bit of a doozy of a video. We all know that the new Outlook will not support VBA. This has major implications. That means Outlook automation will cease to work. That indirectly implies, I suppose, that things like send object will no longer work. And as such, I decided a couple weeks ago to really turn my attention to trying to come up with a solution for this and get a bit ahead of the game for my clients' sake. And basically, per the usual, the solution lies in turning towards what is done in the web. Now, in VBA, we don't really know or use REST APIs. Don't get me wrong, there are a few out there that did and have, but it's not something that's commonly done. And for someone that's new to it, it's a scary thing to get your feet wet into here. But at the end of the day, REST APIs are used everywhere. What it is it's a means from one computer to communicate with another server and make requests. And then the server treats the request and does it or doesn't. It depends on what the request was and if you had permissions and things like that. So in today's discussion, I'm talking about sending emails. So I would make a request here. Please generate this email to this person with this subject line, this content, and send it. And then the server would answer me back saying, nope, something's wrong. And it will give me whatever explanation it wants. Or it will go, yep, everything went well, email sent. So it's a simple operation per se, but there's work to be done behind it to make all of this work. I have two articles that I recently published, and they basically go hand in hand. I created the Outlook one first, so it is the more complete of the two, where I explain certain things, generalities about REST APIs. And then the Google one I made afterwards, and that's what we're going to focus on today. It's working with the Google REST API to interact with Gmail. And I will do at a later date a video about the Outlook Graph API. But in my Google article, the first thing I tell you to do is go look at the Outlook article because it, like I say, has a lot of information. So before we continue on the Google article, let's go look at that Outlook article. Skipping over the very top of it, but basically at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, it's the silent treatment from Microsoft per the usual. There's been an uproar. People are upset about VBA going away, but it's been made pretty clear that it's happening. But we've heard nothing from the different development teams as to what they're doing to mitigate this, what alternatives perhaps they're coming up with. And I find it hard to believe that by now they don't have a plan, whether we like it or not, but that they don't have a plan that they can share. We should already know today that we're going to, redevelop and you won't have to do a thing. We're going to redevelop, but you're going to have to change. Or you guys are going to have to learn to use REST APIs, which is what I'm going to show you today. How it works from a very high level is it works in two facets. First, you have to create an account and set up an account on the web server, the service provider. So with Google, we're going to log into the Google. We're going to create an account there. We're going to do things. For Outlook, we log into the Microsoft setup. They call it Entra, I believe it was called. You set up an account there. You register your app, blah, blah, blah. We will look at that in another video. Once you got your account set up, you've got what they call your credentials. Now you're ready to now go into your application, whatever it is, .NET, JavaScript, PHP, or in our case, I'm going to be using Access, so in VBA. Now you're ready to start doing your coding. And with that information that you got regarding your account, you are now able to do authentication and then send out requests. A very high level examination of the authentication. Before being able to send out requests that do things, we have to authenticate and prove to the server that, hey, you are who you say you are, and you have the right to do things on this server. It doesn't typically just blindly accept requests. So how it works is everything works with URLs and requests and things like that. So we're going to send out a request with the client ID to their server, and it sends back a code. Then we use that and we send another request back to their server with that code and your client ID and typically what they call a scope, so what you're wanting to work with. And we ask for what's called a token. And if everything goes well, the server sends back that token and other information that we store, because that token is like the key. It's like the key to your house. With that token now, whenever you're sending out requests to do things, to perform actions, so in this context, send an email, you include that key. And it tells the server, okay, I'm unlocked, I'm allowed to do it. Now I can process what he wanted me to do. Without that token, the request for that email will not work. So the token is that critical piece of the puzzle. Making requests. The request is always the same basic, format. You need to supply a URL. So this is, you're directing your request to a specific spot. You're going to give a method. There are different methods: post, get, delete, put. Typically, for most of what we do, it's going to be a post or a get. There are exceptions. You have to tell it what type of data is being transacted here. So a lot of it is typically application JSON, which then is your request. Your request is a JSON string, which is this guy here. So it means that you can't just send information any which way. It has to be formatted in a very structured manner. You have to follow rules. You have to follow naming conventions. You have to follow formatting. Something I found, if we're talking specifically about Outlook, and I'm just going to touch upon this briefly now, but I'll talk about it again in the next video regarding Outlook specifically. But I found, after I developed my solution, that they actually had what's called a Microsoft Craft Explorer. So if you're diving into doing this whole thing and trying to figure out sending requests to their API, you want to use this. It's a web interface where you can put in this information, the URL, post, blah, 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 and see how it works, how it doesn't work. It's a lot simpler to work with than necessarily through VBA. A more general tool, however, that has been around for a long time, any web developer is aware of it, is something called Postman. You can download it, use it on your computer, and it works in the same way. You point it to the right place, giving the information, your request, and it will allow you to send it, and you get back the response, and you can see if it works or not before you try to hard code things in VBA or any other language. These are really good tools to just be aware of, especially Postman, because it works with pretty much any environment. To make the request itself, however, we have to create a function in VBA to do so. And this is what mine looks like. And as you can see here, we're supplying the URL, the method, the content type, and the request. Optionally, if it is an authenticated request. What am I talking about? Well, here you come down here, and we're going to use the XML library. And we're going to start by opening up the URL with the method that we specified. Then we're going to set the header to the content type that we've specified. And many instances, like I said, to be able to send out a request and for it to work, we have to authenticate. We have to supply that token. And that's where this guy here comes in. If you said, yes, we need to be authenticated for this request, then it's going to add in that another header that says authorization. It's going to give the token type and the token. And then it sends out the request itself. Then what happens is, through this process, we get sent back the server's response to our request. And it comes in three major parts: the status text, and the response text. In reality, it's the status code. Okay, we don't know why they didn't include that, but it's a numerical value. Now, typically 200 means it was successful. Everything else means there was some type of problem. And I mean 200 range, not just 200 specifically. But like if you think on a website, when you go on a website, you see a 404, an error page, right? It's the same thing. If you were to get a 404 here, there was a problem. So this is how we're able to use that code to know if our request was successful or not. The status text is a little less important. Okay, typically we're interested in the status and the response back. The server will respond back with information. Now it can be very simple, yes, no, success, failure, whatever. Or it can be a very elaborate response with dozens, hundreds of elements. And then you have to have the means to dissect that response. So this here becomes very important, or can be. For instance, let's think of, not Gmail, but let's think of Google Calendar or even the Outlook calendar. We could send a request to the server asking, hey, give me all of my calendar appointments for the month of April. And the response back, as long as it was successful, would include all of those elements. So you could have one appointment, you could have 300. So it depends on what you do and what gets sent back, what needs to get sent back by the server. So this is why you have to be able to take what is sent back and dissect it. And there's different ways of handling that. And this is where we're getting into the next section a little bit. For my needs, I created single standalone functions, 100% VBA, to dissect those responses. However, they meet my need for this specific case. It was just to illustrate sending emails. But as you're going to dive into this, your needs will probably expand beyond wanting or needing to create these one-offs like that. And it becomes more interesting to look at a project like this VBA one that has a JSON, basically library module, that will allow you to manipulate JSON strings in a simpler manner than just parsing like I've done in this instance. So definitely worth checking out. The other thing with JSON is when we're passing JSON strings, making requests, we have to escape certain characters. Certain characters in JSON have very specific meanings. And if we are using them in text, let's say the body of an email, but we don't want it to do something weird in JSON, we want that there. So let's say a double quote. Well, a double quote in JSON means something. It's the beginning or the end. It encapsulates an element, whether it be the parameter name or the parameter value. We don't want it to act like that. We want it to act as a text character in the body. Therefore, we have to escape it, to tell JSON, no, this guy here, he's safe. Don't worry about this quote. This quote is legit. Just leave it alone. And this is where this function comes in. It escapes JSON strings. What I've done is I'm using JavaScript actually to do it. It's a simple JavaScript function that I pass a string to. So I'm going to pass my input string to the function. It's going to escape it and return that string to me, and everything's glorious. Then I have demo databases, and then I always provide resources. So enough, we've gone over the generalities. Let's dive into Google, the Google REST API for Gmail specifically. So once again, I just said Gmail specifically, the same with the Outlook. I'm looking at one specific element, one specific service, shall we say. Do note that in both of these instances, many more are available to you. Like I mentioned previously, you want to work with a calendar? Well, you can. You want to work with contacts? You can. You want to work with notes? You can. So today I'm exploring email, but you can go well beyond that. Anything you can do through the web interface, you can basically do through the REST API. So it really can open up doors here. I'm just getting your foot in the door, but you can go much further. How does it work? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to create an account through the Cloud Console. Okay, so I have a link here. You go there, you log in, you create a new project, you give it a name that you want and whatnot. The next step is you have to create credentials. When I say create credentials, you're going to create an ID, a client ID. You'll also get a client secret. Next, you're going to go on to enable APIs and services, where you're going to make sure that the Gmail API has been included. Mine was by default. I did nothing. A whole slew of APIs were actually included by default. So you can remove the ones you don't need. You can include any you think you're going to use. So adjust the APIs based on what you plan on doing. But the important one for today is that there's a Gmail API included. Then you need to publish, now that you've developed all of this, you need to publish your application. There are different options. I've gone the route where I'm not sending this to Google to be validated or any of this stuff because I'm not selling it. I'm not pushing it out. It's just going to be limited right now on a couple desktops. So I don't need to go through all that brouhaha. But depending on what goal you have, you may have to choose different options. So pay attention to how you publish it and select the right option for you. And then here I have links to different bits of information. One thing, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead here, but when we get into generating the request for sending an email, you're going to ask me, well, how did you know, like, how to create the entry for, let's say, the importance of the email? Okay, was it high importance, medium, low? Well, Google follows the RFC. So we're able to just use the RFC documentation and then come here, and these are all the different things that I could have used. Okay, it goes on. So I date from sender to CC, BCC, all of this stuff makes sense. But if you come down a little bit, you'll see here, importance. I simply clicked on this, came down to importance, and I saw that the values that are allowed are those three. So now I knew that in my VBA code, if I wanted the user to be able to specify the importance of a message, that these were the only three options that were allowable. So then I developed my function in consequence. And it's like that for every single one of these different properties. Okay? So you can go over this, your priorities, sensitivity, language. So you can add as many as you want, or you can keep it very simple and not, like, you don't have to include importance if you don't want to. You don't have to include all sorts of stuff, okay? But you can if you want to. So the RFC guidelines here are very important when you're trying to develop, well, in this case, the mail. Their documentation, Google's documentation, pretty good. You always have the general same problem, whether it be Google or Outlook. They're not highly focused on HTTP directly being accessed the way we do. A lot of their code samples are .NET, they're PHP, they're JavaScript. So it can be a little frustrating at times to figure some of this out. And that's truly where having, let's go back up here. Where are you? Oh, sorry, I missed it. Using the Graph Explorer or Postman can really be useful for doing these tests until you figure out the proper syntax. But use the documentation. It explains, for instance, authentication. So the basic idea is we have to first get authenticated. And like I said to you, we're going to make a request, get a code back, take that code, make another request, get a token back. Then whenever we make subsequent requests to do things, we always have to include that token. Now that token can expire. So sometimes we need to check it. We need to refresh it. We may also at the closing of our application want to go, hey, Google, destroy that token because I'm done. I don't, just for safety reasons, let's kill it. So Google offers all of that. On Counterpoint, Microsoft did not. I found no way to check a token with Microsoft, and I didn't find a way to revoke a token with Microsoft, which was very surprising to me. And you can correct me if someone knows a way, please leave me a comment. But that's the basics of, well, anyway, the theory. Let's dive into the actual program itself. So when you create your account, it doesn't make a difference in which account we're talking about, Outlook, Gmail, whatever. When you create that client ID, you're going to want to come here and insert your client ID here, okay? You're then going to want to include your client secret, well, at least for Google. Outlook, you don't need to include the secret. Don't ask me why, you just don't. So you're going to come here, put that into place, and as soon as you've done that, this demo is now fully functional and ready to roll. I then have up here debug mode. So if you're in development status mode, whatever, you want to make this to true. Why? Because in certain locations in the database, I've added things like this, where if you're in debug mode, it's going to output to the immediate window information that will help you understand if your requests are working properly, what the response from the server was, etc. But only if you're in that debug mode. So when you're in production, you want it to be false, but when you're in development mode, you want it to be true. Similarly, I have these two global variables that I'm using to allow a certain amount of flexibility in the application. So this is the name of the table that stores the information when we do our authentication. So when we finally get that token, and we also get some other information, this is where it's going to get stored. So if you want to change the name of the table, you just change it here, and the rest of the code keeps working. I also have, this is the form that performs the authentication, allows you to do that initial login. So once again, you want to change the name of the form, go for it, change it here, and the rest of the code will continue to work. Also note, for this demo, I've chosen to store it in a table. Obviously, you want to hide that table, but you don't have to use a table. You can store it in the registry, you can store it in database properties, you could store it in encrypted text files. The sky is the limit, you do what makes you happy. But for today's purposes, I'm storing in a table. Where it gets stored really has no consequence. It's what I chose for this demo, that is it. So if we look very briefly, you'll see I have that table, like I said, and it's set up with the fields that I know Google returns when you authenticate. Client ID, secret, scope, access token, refresh token, the token type, when the token was created, and when it expires. This one here is one I've added myself. With this and the expired, I know when my token is done. If I just had the expires, it doesn't give me enough information, so I added this one. And then I have my authentication form. What is my authentication form? It is simply a form with a web browser control, a standard web browser control nonetheless. I don't even need to use the modern web browser control, which means this is completely backwards compatible, this solution. So we close that, we come back here, and that is the Google module. So let's just flip through very quickly the other modules. This is a module just with some links and scopes. When you authenticate, you have to partially include what you're going to be wanting to access, what type of service or operations. They call that the scope. So it could be a read only, it could be a read write, it could be a delete. You get the general idea. I'm lowering this down a bit, but that's the general concept. So these for Gmail are the possible scopes. You could do one where you're just accessing everything, full access, deletion, things like that. Dangerous, be careful with that one. You could do read only. I want to ask Google, what emails did I receive today? Well, I don't need write capacity for that. I'm just going to do a select, right? So I can just use a read only. I want to create an email, but not send it. I want to create a draft. Well, I could just use compose. I want to send an email. Well, in that case, I need send. So you see the different scopes, and you can use multiple scopes. So, you could have a scope, let's say for Gmail, you could have one for the calendar, you could have different scopes, and you can make that all in one request. So you have a token that works across and does all sorts of different things. But the scope is very important to that initial authentication process to get a token that will then enable you to do what you want. Because if you don't put the proper scope, and then you go make a request that's outside of that scope, Google will return, no, I'm not doing it. You don't have the permission to do that. That wasn't what we agreed upon. You aren't authorized to do those things. So just some general links to go get information. Most of this is already on the web article, however. Encoding. Well, when we're sending information to web servers, often we have to encode it. So I have a base64 encoding function, and I have another more general URI one. We've seen the Google Mail. This is where I have the actual function specifically for sending emails. So this would be similar to my Outlook automation email function. And it operates in a similar way. Like I said to you, for sending any request, we have to have a URL, we have to have a content type, we have to have a method. Here we're specifying the subject, the message, etc., etc., etc. We build here our actual request So this is what we're going to be sending the server. This is the request. So this is the email per se. The to, the subject, the body, all that. We're building it all up here, concatenating and building the string. Then we have to encode it, like I said, in a base 64 format. And then because this is JSON, I have to encapsulate it a little bit more in these curly brackets with certain specific property names. And here's the request encapsulated in all of that. And then we send that here. It's part of our HTTP request, which we're looking at next. Then we're going to get a response back. Now, what's important to notice here is we're trying to generate an email. But what have I done first? My URL here, very particular. I'm doing a draft. So my first request is not to send an email. My first request is to generate an email as a draft. So if I get back a status of 200, that worked. That operation, that request was accepted, and it created the draft message for me. It will return an HTTP response text. That request here will return, now that I know it's 200, it was successful. I will get back the ID of that draft email. And I then plug that as my next request here, but now I'm using the URL to send. So I'm telling it now, send the email for the ID that I just created as a draft. So send that draft basically. And if that one worked and I got a 200, then my entire operation worked and that function was successful. So to send my email, I'm actually doing 2 requests. The actual process here, the HTTP send request, this function here, is pretty straightforward. We saw it on the website. So we're going to supply a URL, a method, content type, request, and sometimes it needs to be authenticated. Actually, most of the time it needs to be authenticated. And that's where this comes in. So in the cases that we say, yes, we need authentication, it will then include that token and access token and token type. In the cases where authentication isn't required, so that initial authentication process, obviously, then this is omitted. And then it just basically sends out that, and we get returned the status code, status text, and response back from the server. Auth. This is a big guy. This is the bulk of the initial work because we have to do that handshake. We have to go back and forth. And even when we make future requests, we have to validate that our token is still valid because tokens expire. Okay. And when your token is expired, when you make your request, it won't work. So we have things like check token, where we come here, access token, we're going to pass it our active token, the one that we have in memory in our table, and we're going to ask it, is it still valid basically? This token, can you review it for me? And if it comes back as 200, the token's still good. We're happy. So it's true. If it isn't, then we're going to try to perform a refresh token. So refresh token is we're going to pass our client ID, our secret. We're going to now send a refresh token request with our refresh token value. Because we have an access token, we have a refresh token. And we're going to send that out. And if everything goes smoothly, it will return a response to us, enabling us to then extract all this information from it. Let's look at the extraction process. The extraction process is going to be multiple lines. So I'm going to iterate over those lines. I'm going to extract the parameter and the parameter value. What are some of these parameters? Things like scope, access token, refresh token, token type, the expiry duration in seconds. And like I said, I added this once and I could use this with the expire in to calculate when one of these tokens expires. So basically, it returns this string and I extract all of these things that I then pass to my global variables. And then lastly here, I'm saving that to the table. So it's there and I can refer to it whenever I need. And like I said, I then was able to create a simple function to determine when tokens expire, simply using the expire in with the creation date and time. So then I'm easily able to validate if a token is still good or not. So that's the bulk of that we've done. Then there's revoke token. So if I close my system down, it would make sense to then tell Google, revoke the token, I'm done. Don't leave it live for someone to somehow hack or God knows what. Let's tell Gmail specifically, revoke that. So we use the revoke URL with the access token, and then we just wait for it to come back, and we clear that token out of memory and out of the table because it's no longer valid. We need to re-authenticate if we're going to use anything again. Then I have a couple simple routines here to save all of our data to the table. One here to, this one here is to read from the table. This one here is to save to the table. And this one here is to clear the data from the table and our variables. That's the bulk of that. I have a self-healing object variable for the database. I could easily create more for the HTTP object, for instance. There are more that could be created, and perhaps in a later version of this demo, I will continue to do that. The authentication form itself with the web browser control. Okay, so we first start here by going to the authentication. So we're starting the authentication process. We're going to pass it our client ID, our secret, and we're giving it the scope of we're trying to compose. Okay. So we're just coming, we're making that request. It's going to come back and we're going to navigate to it. Sorry. It's going to come back because we have to give it a redirect URI. So basically, after it completes this, it tries to go somewhere. We're going to tell it to go to HTTP localhost, which is our local computer. But our local computer is not a web server. So this will bomb this, and we're doing that on purpose. It will error, and therefore will trigger the navigation error event, which we're able to employ on purpose to extract from the URL that it redirected us to. We'll be able to extract that code I've mentioned several times. Now with that code in hand, we make a new request here with that code, with our client ID and secret and code. Now we're asking for authorization code, and once again, we're going to send that off, and we're going to wait. And it's going to return back, once again, a string that we're going to extract our components from, and we're going to save. So in this operation here, well, actually in the response, we're going to get back our access token, our refresh token, our expire in, all of that information, as long as it was successful. So this whole process is, the end game is this here. It has allowed us to get our token. Now we can use that token when we're doing Gmail requests. Because part of this here, remember, is we're doing true. And that true is the authentication, which is this here, which requires the access token. Without that access token, our request to send an email will not work. So that's what that is all about. So we're going to use this form one time when we load, or the first time we try to send an email. And then we've got those access tokens in memory in the table. So then we don't need to re-authenticate every single time. It's the one time, and we can use it for the rest of the day. And in some cases, tokens can extend even beyond that as long as you refresh them. So it's possible, and I have that with some clients, where I authenticated them over 2 years ago, but through the refresh token, they've never needed to log back into the system ever. So the system just continues to work flawlessly. The email generator, we'll look at it in 2 seconds, but it really is that simple. I'm simply calling the function. Okay. What is the email generator? Well, let's dive into it. This is what we're here for. Now that we've gone over a summary of all this code and tried to wrap our heads around it, let's look at this guy in production. So the only thing I've done here to make all of this work is I added my client ID and client's secret to that configuration module. So let's open the email generator, and we're going to create an email. So we can make it out to anyone we want. Doesn't make a difference. This is tried to mimic generating an email. No big deal. So we're going to come here. We're going to enter our recipient's email address. And we could put multiple email addresses. Just include the semicolon. Okay. And then we're going to come here and create test email, and hey, how's it going? This is just a test. It'd be good if I didn't fat finger. And you can see here we have even options. The importance, let's make it high. We can say there's no HTML, so it's a plain text. So we've done what we wanted. You can add CCs, BCCs, all of that stuff. We're going to say send. It's going to go and run, and it's going to pop open our authentication form because we do need to log in once. So if you have it in memory, great. If you don't, you're going to have to provide your credentials. Mine's still in memory, so I can just simply click on it. Because of the way I published this one, this hasn't been verified, so there's these extra clicks that I have to go through. And then continue, give it a second. Now it's doing that handshake that I talked about with the code, and eventually it comes back and it tells me that it worked. And it automatically closes, and then it continues with my function now that it's authenticated, and it does the send email successfully. And I will verify that. And indeed, the email worked. Now, just to illustrate, we could integrate a tiny MCE interface here. We could do all sorts of things. I've shown that in older demos that I had where you can make and extend HTML. But right now, this is just a simple test. And I can come in here and I can do something like, let's bold this string. Okay, so you can use HTML and then do the send, the same function, and bam, it worked. So as you can see, once this is set up, and I know there's a lot of setup there, but once it's set up, this form now works flawlessly, and you only have that initial login. After that, as long as your information in the table is valid, it works. And part of the process of sending is to validate, do that check of the token. So the authentication keeps trying to refresh the token and avoid it expiring. That way you never need to log back in again. So this can continue to work and operate just flawlessly in your application without issue. And like I said, right here, I'm simply doing an email. So I was just trying to get back some basic functionality. And I can do plain text, I can do HTML, we can include attachments, you can do all sorts of things. So I was aiming for that. Next, eventually, perhaps, I may be going down the avenue of pushing the email further, so doing querying, retrieving emails, and also possibly looking at the calendar, but I'm not 100% sure if I really want to go down that route. I think here's a great point in time to just say, you know, if you like this type of work, please like, share, subscribe. It's the only way I can continue to do these things. You're not going to find many other people showing you how to do REST API. I need your support to continue to do my work. That being said, you know, at the same time I'm asking you to do those things, I also would love to know, you know, today I'm showing you email, and in my other video that I'll do for Outlook, it will be very similar. I'm just going to basically identify the differences. But are you guys interested in being able to retrieve emails from your Outlook? Are you interested in retrieving emails from Gmail? Are you interested in being able to play around with your appointments and whatnot in your calendars? You know, perhaps leave me some comments as to what truly is useful and what would be a waste of my time. And I will try to make videos particular to those aspects that are of value to you. And perhaps, you know, reviewing content isn't as important as being able to create new ones. You guys leave me some comments and let me know the direction that you possibly would like this future videos on this subject matter to go. Are there other REST APIs you'd like me to explore? I've done extensive work for some clients using the Zero REST API for accounting. And I've been surprised. It's worked extremely well. One of the easiest APIs I've ever used and well documented too. So, you know, if there are things you want me to explore, I will, or at least I will look into it. But you need to leave me comments and feedback and like, share, subscribe, spread the word. I am going to stop here. This is already a long enough video. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been insightful and informative, and opens the possibility here of being able to survive Microsoft deprecating VBA in Outlook. I know this was about Gmail, but the exact same principle remains. The thing that changes you're going to see is just this function. At the end of the day, it's the JSON string that Microsoft expects is not exactly the same as the one expected by Google. But HTTP, OAuth, all of that stuff is very similar. There are a couple exceptions. I think I had mentioned it earlier that Outlook or the Google API has things like check token and revoke token, and for some reason Microsoft does not. So yeah, but beyond that, all the rest of it remains the same. The other notable thing, when I've used the Microsoft one, it does not use the client secret for some reason. So it generates one when you create the app, but it's not required to do the authentication or do any type of operation. So whatever, minor thing. But in general, 95% of the code remains exactly the same. The authentication remains the same. The only big change is this function here is remarkably different because we have to generate a different type of string. But we will look at that in a future video. And yeah, thank you once again. Have a great day, everyone, and take care.